In the year 1836, deep in the rolling countryside of Tennessee, there stood a grand estate that both fascinated and terrified the nearby villagers. From a distance, the Whitaker Estate looked like a symbol of prosperity. White columns stretching tall against the sky, acres of farmland surrounding it, and its owners walking with the kind of dignity only wealth and influence could afford. But for those who lived in its shadow, the house was not just an imposing mansion. It was a place of whispers, a house that seemed to carry a weight too heavy for its walls. The Whitaker name carried both respect and unease. Elijah Whitaker, the patriarch, was a tall and severe man, with piercing eyes that seemed to look straight through a person. His wife, Margaret, appeared stoic, almost statuesque in her stern demeanor, and rarely spoke in public. They were known for their strict religious views, the kind that even the most devout churchgoers found unsettling. They preached often about purity, about sin, and about how the young could be molded into something holy. Their words seemed harmless in sermons, but when spoken by them, they held an edge that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. The estate itself was unsettling in ways that were hard to explain. At night, faint lights flickered from its upper windows long after the family was thought to be asleep. Sometimes, villagers swore they heard the faint cries of children drifting through the woods near the mansion, only to find no trace when they looked closer. The estate's groundskeeper once left suddenly, never to return, and when asked about it years later, he refused to speak a word of what he had seen. It was in these same years that the village began to experience something darker: children disappearing. At first, it was just one child, a little boy who had been playing near the edge of the woods. His parents searched desperately, calling his name until their voices cracked, but he was never found. Then, months later, a young girl vanished while helping her mother gather berries. One by one, more children slipped away, as if swallowed by the land itself. At first, the villagers tried to find logical explanations: wild animals, accidents, the dangers of wandering too far into the thick Tennessee forests. But the numbers grew. Nearly a dozen children gone in just a few years, and all under similar circumstances. Their parents wept, searching with lanterns deep into the night, only to return empty-handed. As the disappearances increased, so too did the whispers, and those whispers always seemed to circle back to the Whitaker estate. People remembered the strange sounds, the flickering lights, the way Elijah Whitaker seemed to glare at children with an intensity that was anything but fatherly. They recalled Margaret's cold silence, and the odd way she sometimes followed the village children with her eyes, as though she were studying them. But despite their suspicions, no one dared confront the Whitaker. They were powerful, connected to the church and the law, and had money that spoke louder than any accusation. Even in daylight, children would clutch their mothers' skirts when the Whitakers passed through the market, avoiding their gaze. The mansion loomed larger than ever in the minds of the villagers, a place of unanswered questions and unspoken terror. Something was wrong within those walls. Everyone knew it, but no one had the courage to find out. And so, the disappearances continued, one by one, as the shadow of the Whitaker estate grew darker over Tennessee. Elijah Whitaker was a man who carried authority like a weapon. Wherever he walked, silence followed. His tall frame and rigid posture gave him an air of command that discouraged anyone from questioning him. The villagers often saw him in the church pews, sitting stiff and solemn, his Bible clasped firmly in his hand. But when he spoke, there was something in his voice that unsettled even the most faithful. He spoke of sin, as though it were a living creature that lurked inside every child, waiting to consume them. He spoke of sacrifice and cleansing, of a divine mission that only a chosen few could carry out. To many, his sermons sounded more like warnings than teachings. Margaret Whitaker was his shadow, always present but rarely speaking. She dressed in black more often than not, her pale face framed by tightly pinned hair. Her eyes, though quiet, carried a strange weight, as if she were constantly observing and judging the souls around her. She rarely smiled, rarely softened, and when she did speak, her words echoed her husband's conviction. The two of them seemed bound by something more than marriage, bound by a belief that no one else dared to embrace. In public, they appeared disciplined, proper, even charitable. They donated to the church, hired villagers to work their land, and were known to open their estate to visiting preachers. But there was always a sense of performance about it, as though what the villagers saw was only a mask. Those who worked inside the estate for short periods, maids, cooks, field hands, would sometimes leave abruptly. They would claim personal reasons, but their pale faces and nervous silences told a different story. Once, a young girl who had been employed as a maid came running back to her family in the dead of night, refusing to explain why she fled. All she managed to whisper, through trembling lips, was that she would never go back, not even if her life depended on it. As the years passed, the Whitakers became even more isolated. The estate gates were kept locked more often, and strangers were rarely allowed inside. The sound of construction was heard coming from the back of the property, though no one knew what was being built. Deliveries were made to the estate at odd hours, wagons arriving under the cover of darkness, carrying crates that disappeared into the cellar. The villagers whispered about it endlessly, but again no one dared to confront them. The Whitakers had influence, friends in positions of power who shielded them from suspicion. Whenever a family attended church, Elijah's eyes would linger on the younger ones, sometimes smiling faintly, as if marking them for something only he understood. Margaret, standing beside him, would nod subtly as though confirming an unspoken agreement. Parents felt a chill when those eyes fell on their children, but they convinced themselves it was harmless. After all, the Whitakers had never been caught doing anything wrong. But unease was growing. By the late 1830s, too many children had vanished for it to be ignored. Families whispered in private, mothers wept quietly in their kitchens, fathers clenched their fists in helpless anger. The forest was searched countless times, the river dragged, even neighboring towns were questioned, but there was never a trace, not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing. It was as though the children had been erased from existence, and in every whispered conversation, the same thought crept in. Perhaps the children had not vanished into the wilderness at all. Perhaps they had been taken somewhere far more sinister, somewhere very close. Still, fear held the villagers in place. The Whitakers were untouchable, and no one wanted to risk their wrath. So people prayed, they kept their children close, and they tried to believe that the nightmare would somehow end. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The nightmare was only just beginning, and the Whitaker estate was its beating heart. By the summer of 1838, the disappearances had become impossible to dismiss as accidents. The forest could not be blamed forever, nor could the river that ran through the valley. Too many families had lost their children, and too many of them under circumstances that were eerily similar. A boy playing marbles in the road vanished while his friends looked away for just a moment. A little girl picking flowers in her mother's garden was suddenly gone, leaving only the flowers scattered on the ground. Each time it happened, panic spread through the village like wildfire, but the search parties always ended in the same crushing disappointment. There were no footprints to follow, no torn fabric caught on branches, no signs of struggle. The children had simply disappeared. With every new vanishing, suspicion thickened. People whispered that the Whitaker estate was cursed, that Elijah and Margaret were practicing something unholy behind those locked gates. Mothers noticed that many of the missing children had last been seen near the estate's boundary walls, their laughter echoing as they played close to the forbidden grounds. Some even remembered seeing Elijah watching from a distance, his tall frame motionless, his gaze fixed upon the children. The memory unsettled them now, but at the time, no one had dared accuse him aloud. There were nights when villagers claimed they heard strange sounds drifting across the fields from the estate, the sound of chains rattling, muffled cries, and on some nights what could only be described as chanting. But the sounds came at hours when no one dared venture out. Doors stayed bolted, candles snuffed, and families huddled together in silence, praying that whatever was happening up on that hill would not reach their homes. One evening, a small group of fathers gathered in secret, their grief and anger too heavy to contain. They spoke of the children, of the way the sheriff seemed reluctant to question the Whitakers, of how money and influence seemed to shield the family from even suspicion. One man swore he had seen a child being led by Margaret into the side door of the estate, and that same child had never been seen again. His voice shook as he spoke, and the others clenched their fists, torn between fear and the desperate need for answer. They talked of storming the estate, of breaking open its doors and demanding the truth. But as the night grew late, their courage waned. They knew what such an act would mean. The Whitakers had powerful friends in Nashville and beyond. Accusing them without proof could cost not just their reputations, but their lives. So the fathers returned home, defeated, their silence adding to the village's growing sense of doom. The next morning, another child was gone. By now, the number of missing children had reached into the dozens. Some families had lost more than one. The church pews seemed emptier every Sunday, the silence of absent voices echoing in a way that made the sermons feel hollow. The townsfolk prayed harder, sang louder, and clung to their faith with trembling hands. But faith offered no answers, only the gnawing suspicion that the evil among them wore the face of respectability. The Whitaker estate loomed over them all, its tall windows glinting in the sun by day and glowing faintly at night, as if lit by fires that no one could see. The children avoided even looking at it, and parents forbade them to go near the gate. But still, from time to time, a curious boy or a daring girl would wander too close, and often they would never be seen again. The estate became a place of dread, but it was also a place of paralysis. Everyone knew something was happening within those walls, but no one could say it aloud. Fear bound the village as tightly as any chain, and with every passing month, the shadow of the Whitakers grew longer, stretching like a curse across the Tennessee hills. One autumn night, the air in the village was heavy with unease. The moon was low, pale and swollen, and the field stretched quiet under its light. A group of men, restless and unable to sleep, gathered near the edge of the woods that bordered the Whitaker estate. They had been hearing the strange noises for weeks, clanging metal, hurried footsteps, and faint voices that seemed to rise and fall like a prayer. Each of them had lost someone, or knew someone who had, and though fear clung to them like a second skin, grief was driving them forward. They crept closer to the boundary wall, their boots sinking into the damp soil, and crouched among the tall grass. From that distance the estate looked even more monstrous, its windows glowing faintly against the dark. But what caught their attention was the sound. At first it was only a faint hum, low and rhythmic. Then came the sharper noises, the crack of a whip, the dragging of chains, and the thin strangled cries of children. The men froze, their eyes darting to one another in silent terror. It was no longer just rumor. The cries were real. One of them, a farmer named Thomas, leaned closer to the wall and pressed his ear to the cold stone. His face went pale. He could hear voices, Elijah's voice, deep and commanding, speaking words he couldn't understand. Beside it, Margaret's voice joined in, her tone higher, steadier, like she was reciting something memorized. And beneath them, the crying of children rose and fell, muffled as though coming from deep underground. Thomas pulled away quickly, shaking his head, and whispered that they had to leave. The others were torn. Every instinct screamed at them to run, to pretend they had heard nothing. But the thought of their own children, the ones asleep in their beds, the ones they prayed would still be there come morning, kept them rooted. One man suggested breaking through the gates right then, charging into the estate, and putting an end to whatever was happening. Another grabbed him by the arm and hissed that such a thing would mean death for them all. The Whitakers were untouchable, and without proof, they would be branded as liars or worse, as criminals themselves. So they did nothing. They slipped back into the darkness of the woods, their hearts pounding with shame and fear, and they carried that silence home with them. Not one of them spoke of what they had heard, not even to their wives.
They told themselves it was safer to protect the families they still had, than to risk losing everything in a futile act of defiance. But silence did not stop the estate. That winter, 3 more children vanished. Each time, the searchers went through the motions. Men with lanterns combing the fields, women weeping into their hands. But by now, a grim resignation had taken root in the village. They no longer asked whether the children would be found. They asked only how many more would be lost before someone finally acted. And still, the Whitaker estate stood untouched, its walls hiding whatever horrors played out inside, its windows gleaming faintly like watchful eyes. The men who had listened by the wall never spoke of it, but they carried the sounds with them, the rattle of chains, the muffled cries, and each night when they closed their eyes, those sounds returned, reminding them of what they had failed to do. The village lived in fear, and the Whitakers thrived in secrecy, their rituals continuing unchecked, as the shadow over Tennessee grew darker still.
It was a bitter night in early spring when fate finally struck the Whitaker estate. A storm had rolled across the Tennessee hills, bringing lightning that split the sky into jagged veins of white fire. The villagers, huddled in their cabins, watched from a distance as one of those bolts found its mark. It struck the estate's roof with a deafening crack, and within moments, flames licked at the wooden beams, spreading fast through the grand house. The alarm spread quickly, bells rang out in the village, and men rushed toward the estate, carrying buckets, shovels, and whatever tools they could find. Though fear of the Whitakers still lingered in their hearts, there was no time to hesitate. Fire threatened to consume everything. But as they drew closer, the flames illuminated the mansion in a terrifying way. The house seemed alive, glowing from within. Each window a furnace of orange light, smoke billowed into the sky, and the crackling roar of the blaze drowned out every other sound. The sheriff, accompanied by several men, forced their way inside, hoping to rescue anyone who might still be trapped. What they found was chaos. Furniture toppled, hallways filled with smoke, the air choking and hot. Elijah and Margaret were nowhere to be seen. Some claimed later they had caught sight of them fleeing into the woods, though no one could say for certain. What was certain, however, was the strange sight of doors that had been bolted shut from the outside, leading down into the lower parts of the house. With the fire threatening to consume everything, the men broke the locks and forced the doors open. A rush of heat and smoke billowed up from below, but so too did something else. A smell that was unmistakable, one that turned their stomachs before they even descended the steps. The sheriff held a lantern high, leading the way into the darkness. The cellar stretched deep beneath the estate, far larger than anyone could have imagined, its stone walls damp and cold, and there, illuminated by the flickering lantern light, was the truth that the village had feared, but never dared to confront. Chains hung from the walls, rusted but still sturdy, each one ending in iron cuffs, small enough to hold the wrists of a child. Scratches covered the stone where desperate hands had clawed for freedom. Wooden toys, broken and rotting, lay scattered across the dirt floor. Faded scraps of children's clothing clung to the corners, and in the far reaches of the cellar, small bones were piled in heaps, some still bearing the remnants of fabric, some clutching objects, as if even in death they had not let go. The men stood frozen, unable to speak, their minds struggling to grasp what their eyes were showing them. The lantern light danced across drawings, etched into the walls, strange symbols, crude figures of children, and the unmistakable hand of Margaret, who had sketched rows of wide-eyed faces, each one hauntingly familiar. They were portraits of the missing children, captured in ink and charcoal, lined up as though catalogued for some dark ritual. The sheriff's hand trembled so violently that the lantern nearly slipped from his grasp. Behind him, one of the men retched violently,
the sound echoing in the cellar. Others fell to their knees, clutching their mouths, horrified by the enormity of what lay before them. For years they had wondered, for years they had whispered, but now the truth was carved into stone and bone. The fire above roared louder, showering sparks down the stairwell, forcing them to retreat. But no one who entered that cellar ever forgot what they had seen. By the time they returned to the surface, the estate was collapsing, timbers groaning and crashing as the blaze devoured the house. The cellar, however, remained. The earth seemed determined to preserve it, as though the ground itself refused to let those horrors be erased. That night, the Whitaker estate was reduced to ruin. Yet what was uncovered in the depths of its cellar ensured that its shadow would haunt Tennessee forever. The villagers had their proof, but it came too late for the children whose cries had once echoed in the dark. The fire eventually died, leaving behind only smoldering ruins and a blackened shell of what had once been the grand Whitaker estate. For a time, the villagers avoided the property altogether, afraid of what lingered there. But the sheriff could not ignore what he and his men had seen beneath the house. When the smoke cleared and the embers cooled, he ordered a return to the cellar, determined to uncover every secret it held. By daylight, the truth was even more horrifying. What had first been glimpsed in the flicker of lanterns now stood in full, undeniable detail. The cellar stretched like a labyrinth, its walls lined with iron rings and shackles. Each small alcove told its own story. Scratched prayers etched into stone, names carved by desperate hands, tally marks that spoke of days counted in silence. Some alcoves still held skeletal remains, tiny skulls and fragile bones lying in positions that suggested they had never been free. In the largest chamber, the sheriff's men found something worse. A crude altar had been built from stone blocks, stained dark with what could only be blood. Around it were remnants of ritual objects, bowls filled with ashes, charred bits of cloth, and candles melted into grotesque shapes. On the walls above the altar were more drawings, these more elaborate than the others. They showed children standing in rows, hands bound, faces blank. Above them loomed the crude figures of a man and woman, unmistakably Elijah and Margaret Whitaker. In every drawing, the children were surrounded by symbols, strange markings that no one recognized, twisted crosses and circles that seemed to mock the faith the Whitakers had once pretended to uphold. The pages were filled with Elijah's handwriting, verses twisted from scripture, rambling thoughts about purity and sacrifice, and careful records of the children taken. Each name was listed, each date marked, as though the disappearances had been part of a plan too vast and cruel for the human mind to accept. In the margins, Margaret had added her own notes, cold and precise, about the children's behavior, their resistance, and the rituals performed. Together, the writings painted a picture of obsession, an unholy mission they believed was divine, one that demanded the suffering of the innocent to cleanse the sins of the world. The sheriff, hardened by years of work, wept openly when he read the name. So many children, so many families destroyed, all while the Whitakers stood in church, pretending to be people of faith. The men who accompanied him fell into silence, their faces pale, their hands trembling, as they turned page after page. No one spoke aloud what they were all thinking, that they had failed. The villagers had known something was wrong, had whispered their suspicions for years, but fear had kept them quiet, and in that silence, the Whitakers had thrived. Word spread quickly. Mothers who had lost children came to the ruins, collapsing in grief when they saw the cellar for themselves. Fathers raged, some demanding that the sheriff hunt down Elijah and Margaret at once, others too broken to even speak. But the Whitakers were gone. Whether they had perished in the fire or escaped into the wilderness, no one could say. Some claimed to have seen two figures vanishing into the night as the flames rose, but no bodies were ever recovered. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The villagers tried to bury the cellar, to cover the horror with soil and stone, but the ground seemed unwilling. Each attempt to fill it in was washed away by rain or crumbled back into the darkness. Eventually, they gave up, leaving the cellar exposed, like an open wound. No one built on the land again. It became a place of warning, a reminder of what had been done there and of the price of silence. The Whitaker name was never spoken in reverence again. It became a curse, a dark story passed from parent to child. A warning, whispered at night, stay away from the old estate, for its ghosts still linger. And though the mansion itself was gone, the cellar remained, a monument to the children who had vanished and the evil that had claimed them.
Years passed, but the memory of the Whitaker estate never faded. The land where it once stood grew wild, overtaken by vines and thickets, the charred stones sinking slowly into the soil. Yet, no matter how much time weathered its ruins, no one in Tennessee could forget what had been uncovered in that cellar. Parents warned their children to keep away, and travelers passing through the valley were told the story in hushed voices, as if speaking it too loudly might awaken something that should remain buried. But even as the estate crumbled, the whispers continued. Some said they could still hear children crying in the night when the wind blew from the hills. Others swore they had seen figures moving among the ruins, pale shapes slipping between the trees, small hands reaching out from the shadows only to vanish when approached. The most terrifying stories came from those who claimed to have seen Margaret herself, her stern figure standing silently at the edge of the cellar, watching, waiting, as if she was still searching for the next child to claim. The sheriff never stopped searching for the Whitakers. For years he followed rumors of a tall man and a pale woman moving from town to town under different names, leaving behind unease wherever they went. But no arrests were ever made, and the trail always went cold. Some believed the Whitakers had died in the fire, their bodies reduced to ash before anyone could find them. Others insisted they had escaped, slipping into the wilderness to continue their rituals in secret. That uncertainty became part of the terror, that the evil was never truly destroyed, only scattered into the dark. The villagers who had once kept silent carried their guilt for the rest of their lives. They confessed to their children and grandchildren about the nights they had heard the cries and done nothing. They told of the whispers in the church, the strange looks from Elijah and Margaret, the fear that had chained their tongues. And though they could not undo the past, they passed down the story as a warning. The Whitaker estate became a legend, a cautionary tale about what happens when people look away from evil out of fear. Over time, travelers seeking ghost stories began to visit the ruins. They came with lanterns, daring one another to peer into the cellar, to see if the stories were true. Some left laughing, but others left pale and shaken, claiming they had heard faint voices calling from the dark, or felt the brush of unseen hands tugging at their clothes. A few never returned at all, their disappearance adding new chapters to the legend. Generations later, the land still lies abandoned. No one has dared to build there. No crops grow in its soil, and no animals linger near its edges. The cellar remains, its stone steps leading down into a darkness that feels older than the earth itself. And on certain nights when the air is still and the moon is high, the cries of lost children are said to echo once more, rising from beneath the ground where innocence was stolen, and where the shadow of Elijah and Margaret Whitaker still lingers. The house is gone, the family is gone, but the evil they left behind has never been buried. And so, the story of the Whitaker estate lingers like a scar upon Tennessee's past. A mansion once built as a symbol of power now exists only in memory, its ruins swallowed by time, its cellar whispering the cries of those who never came home. The Whitakers themselves vanished into legend. Whether they perished in the flames or escaped into the darkness will never be known. But the horrors they left behind remain etched into the land, into the hearts of those who remember, and into the warnings passed down from parent to child. It is a chilling reminder that evil often hides behind respectability,
that silence can be as deadly as sin, and that some shadows never fade. Even now, more than a century later, the winds that sweep across the Tennessee hills are said to carry the faint voices of children, calling from beneath the earth, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to listen. The Whitaker Estate is gone, but its story lives on, a tale not just of horror, but of what happens when fear overpowers courage, and when a community closes its eyes to the darkness in its midst. And perhaps that is the most frightening truth of all.